Okay, so hi everyone. So today we have Neekon as our speakers. He will talk about memory checking. And feel free to ask him any question during the talk, and let's welcome him.
Thank you so much, Hal. So yeah, happy to be here. Feel free to ask any questions over Zoom, in person. I welcome it. Please stop me if something's unclear. Yeah, today I'll be talking about some joint work I did with Alep Boyle and Ilan Komargodski. The setting we're going to be in today is one of remote cloud storage. So your goal is to perform some computation, let's say, that requires lots of storage, lots of space. But the issue is that you don't have enough space to do this yourself, maybe even to store your input data. You know, you can think of lots of examples here, like file storage. You have some user data you're doing analytics on. There are many different settings that apply here. And a common solution to this is to use a remote cloud as your storage mechanism to store your data for your computations. So here's the basic setup. You're the user, you have some data source that's coming to you, let's say. And then there's some external server here, which we're going to assume throughout this work is a passive server. So the server here is not doing any computational work besides storing data. And then the user might, issue RAM requests, like write data at address 3 or index 3. It'll write some data prime to address 8, let's say. And then when you want to read the third index, you'll get back some data. And this could go on for many number of rounds with reads and writes. This naturally motivates a lot of questions of trust, though. Like, well, what trust issues come up in this setting? One is privacy, in the sense that the server may see your data that you're putting on the server. It's very natural. And ideally, you'd want to hide the content of any data cells that you put on the server. And another one is that another privacy issue is that the server can see where you're accessing. Like it could see that you're looking at index 3 or index 8. And ideally, you'd want to hide the access pattern. You want to hide where you want to look, because even that can reveal very devastating effects.
Am I in a PIR talk? Because everyone is talking about PIR these days. That's why you also work for PIR? Oh, okay.
Not too much PIR in this talk, but we'll see. Yeah, this talk will be mostly about this next issue of trust, which is integrity, which is that if the server did become an active server, like a malicious server, it could potentially modify your data. And ideally, you'd want some way to verify that whatever data you're getting back from the server is correct. You want to make sure that the server is behaving as an honest, passive storage mechanism. And just as sort of a off-topic hint here, like you can imagine some combination of these concerns. You could imagine some subtle issue coming up where maybe by an active adversary, they could somehow mess up your data in a way that could reveal private information that it otherwise shouldn't have. Okay, let's talk about these issues, one by one. So for the privacy of the cell's content, a very natural solution is encrypt the database entries. And this totally works. Private key encryption will do the trick. Encrypt your data on the server and decrypt it on the way back. Or if you don't want any computational assumptions, you could secret share your database across multiple servers that you assume are not colluding. The second issue of hiding the access pattern is the solution to this is exactly called oblivious RAM. ORAM is exactly going to hide the access pattern. And yeah, intuitively, it scrambles any access pattern into one that's oblivious of the underlying user access pattern. And there is a lot to say about ORAM that I certainly will not in this talk, but a very, very rich history of different ORAM constructions is here. And you can see here that they're improving their overhead, which is an efficiency metric I'll talk about in a little bit over time. And then there's this last construction, Optorama, which is tight in the sense that there's a lower bound here, an unconditional lower bound that applies to any online version of ORAM, that it's totally independent of any cryptographic assumptions, and it doesn't make any encoding assumptions about how your protocol works.
Is it completely implementable or just curious?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question. Path ORAM is certainly very concretely implementable. There is some recent work called Futurama that claims some version of this log-n construction is efficiently implementable, but with more local storage. Yeah, I'm sure Elaine could give you a much more informed answer than I could. Okay, so let's talk about this third issue, integrity. which is about verifying honest server behavior. So just as a warm-up to get started, like, can we prevent the adversary from modifying your data? No, you can't. I mean, the server could just modify your data. If you have limited storage, there's nothing you can really do to prevent that from happening. But what you can hope for is preventing the adversary from undetectably modifying your data. And this is exactly what a memory checker does. Yeah, so just to summarize, a memory checker is a protocol that prevents adversaries from undetectably modifying data stored on some external cloud. And this is introduced in 1991, over 30 years ago. So let me introduce memory checking in this sort of in this setup we had from earlier. The memory checker is now going to be some intermediary between the user and the server that takes in read or write RAM queries from the user, compiles them into some sequence of compiled query hats, and then returns a response to the user. And the user can do this in a repeated online manner. And just to give some like words to these different types of queries, I'm going to call the queries between the user and the memory checker as logical queries, and the queries between the memory checker and the server as these physical queries, these like compile these query hats that we see on the right. There are two properties we require of memory checkers. The first one is like a natural completeness condition that just says if the server is being an honest server, in other words, all of these query hats are correct, then the memory checker should give a correct response. This green check mark here. Like if everything is honest, the user should get the right answer to the RAM query. But the interesting condition for memory checkers is soundness, which says that for any malicious server that tries to corrupt responses to the memory checker does one of two things. Either it gives the correct response, indicated by this green arrow, or it raises some flag, some indication that something went wrong, or that, like, you know, the server was being malicious in some way, and so I don't know what the right answer would be. Yeah, so it has the guarantee that it will never give an incorrect response to the user. It's either going to be a correct response to the user, or it will say, I don't know, the server did something it shouldn't have done. And there are ways to quantify this in terms of parameters for completeness and soundness, but for now, let me just stick to this high-level explanation.
So, Neekon, if you were to build such a thing, you would probably use max anywhere.
Good. Okay. So yeah, maybe as a quick aside, a natural solution, a natural attempt at a solution here would just be to use max message authentication codes. You just like map your physical server as exactly a copy of your logical server, but you're just adding a MAC everywhere. The issue with this is that you can do replay attacks, in the sense that, like, if you've written to a cell twice, the server can respond with either the old version or the new version of your data. And the point is, for arbitrary user sequences, this is going to be hard to figure out which is which. And you'll see from our lower bound sequence that this is, because of max, this is the only sort of attack that can really happen. It's a great question.
So you have mostly bad news for us in this.
Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there.
Do we need to protect the privacy of the data?
Good.
Server?
Good. You in this talk, we're not considering any privacy.
Okay, so servers can learn its own data.
Yeah.
And like accessing pattern.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides, actually. Any other questions before I move on? All right. A natural application that I motivated at the beginning is file storage. So you're a user, you want to store some files on some server. What you can do now is you can run a memory checker instance locally. And now you have the promise that if one of these, cloud companies is evil, or if, there's some malicious actor who breaks into one of these companies, they can't force an incorrect response to the user. You have some promise that the user is either going to get the right answer or some flag indicating malicious behavior. Another application is in secure hardware. So some hardware enclaves allow users to execute programs securely, even within computing environments that are not trusted. But an issue with some of these enclaves is that they don't have a lot of internal space that's trusted. And so what you can do is you can use external space to the enclave as memory. And if you run the memory checker instance within the enclave, you now have the promise that whatever computation you're running is going to get the correct answer back to the user. I'll briefly mention some like other sort of applications. Memory checkers are also related to provable data possession and retrievability systems. And there's a related notion of memory checking called offline memory checking, which is a version where there's like a bunch of user queries, and then at the end, you just have to say either they were all correct or there was some issue somewhere. And this notion of memory checking has been used in a lot of practical smart constructions and accumulation schemes. Okay, let me talk about what efficiency metrics we care about for memory checking. There are two main ones. One is local space, which is the amount of space the memory checker can store in a locally in a trusted way. So here we're assuming that the adversary cannot corrupt the data like your trusted local space. And you can consider variants of memory checking where this is private or not private. They're both interesting questions. Everything I'll talk about in this talk will apply to both settings. So as a quick warm-up, if your RAM stores n entries logically, then a space, like a local space n solution is trivial. Because if you're trusting the whole RAM, you could just store the whole RAM yourself. There's nothing really interesting going on. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to assume the space bound of at most n to the 1 minus epsilon for some epsilon. And so like I might denote this local space by this RAM looking picture here within the memory checker. Mm-hmm.
How low can that space generally? Is it always n to the 1 minus epsilon, or could we potentially get much lower?
You can potentially get much lower. So for upper bounds, you can really get this very close to log n, depending on how strong your crypto primitives you're willing to assume. Essentially speaking, it could be as small as the like output size of the hash function that you trust. Yeah, essentially, I'll get to this in a little bit, but in your head, you can think of the construction of this as like a Merkle tree.
Okay.
Or there's some PRF version of this. And really what you'd store in that local space is the root of a Merkle tree. So just one hash value. Good question. But yeah, for the sake of a lower bound, we want to assume the largest space possible.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Good. And the second notion of efficiency that we're considering that we really want to optimize is the query complexity or the overhead. And this is going to be the number of query hats, like from the number of physical queries from the memory checker to the server. So it's the number of the arrows here from the memory checker to the right.
You don't care about how much time the server takes, for instance.
Yeah, we did. Well, the server should be honest, so it should just be a RAM database.
Like maybe the queries are small, but the server has to probably like I guess take a linear pass on the RAM.
So in this model, we're assuming the server is really passive, like it shouldn't do any computational work.
Yes.
So yeah, we're essentially making the user do that work in terms of
It's just RAM.
It's just RAM.
Yeah.
The honest server is just doing RAM. A malicious server could do anything. Yeah, good question. Good. So let me talk about what's known in terms of query complexity, in terms of constructions. So there are two notions of soundness you can consider. Just in this one line, I'll talk about statistical soundness, where we want soundness against adversaries that are computationally unbounded. And in this case, for local space n to the 1 minus epsilon, there's an n to the epsilon upper bound. Like there's a construction that gets n to the epsilon query complexity. And there's actually a matching lower bound up to constant factors. And this is tight, therefore, because these things match. And more generally, there's a trade-off that says anything where the space times the query complexity is linear, you can achieve, and this is going to be tight. But now, and here and for the rest of the talk, we'll consider computationally sound memory checkers. So memory checkers that are only supposed to be secure against computationally bounded adversaries. Here, a natural construction is a Merkle tree, as I previously alluded to. So here, like what's going to happen? You're going to store the full Merkle tree on the server, and every time you do a user lookup, you're going to query all the log n locations from the root to the leaf of your tree, and this will get log of n queries. And you'll just store maybe the hash key and the root of the Merkle tree in your local trusted storage. It turns out you can do like an optimization of this by being clever about your word size to get this to be log of n over log n, but it's essentially Merkle. It's related to Merkle ideas. And but this begs the question, can you do better or can you do?
This log in by log n is like even smaller than the length of total number of indices, right?
Log n over log n.
Like n is the.
Yeah. So I mean, the word sizes here will be like polylogarithmic, but this is kind of the query complexity, not the like communication complexity.
Right, so that's interesting. So you can't even like write down the size of the RAM. Is that right?
Yeah, but this is I think the
It's
number of
strict, not order.
this is the number of queries, not the space.
Oh,
Space
sorry,
is-
sorry, yes.
Space is equity 1 minus epsilon.
Of course.
Yeah, the local space is not the 1 minus epsilon, and I'm gonna allow like blocks of words here sent between the memory checker, or actually both user memory checker and memory checker server. And that could be like polylogarithmic in it. And I'm just counting the number of those messages passed, not the bit complexity.
Is there any dependence on epsilon in the profound?
Not really. I mean, it depends on the strength of your crypto assumption. This log n over log n, you can make it depending how secure are your hash functions, I guess,
I see.
or how secure are your PRFs. Like the Papamonthu Tomasia construction actually uses a PRF version of this, like an integrity tree. And there, it just like how small of a PRF key can you get? It's in the local space. But in the Merkle construction, it'll just be a hash root. So it depends on what crypto you're seeing. Right, but it begs the question, just going back to the talk, is there a lower bound? Like, can you do better or is there a lower bound?
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
So is it important that those queries are like in parallel or sequential?
They could be sequential or in parallel. So like either one of those is fine. You can think of a Merkle thing as really doing like a parallel thing. Like you could for a Merkle write, you could do it in like 2 queries, I guess, right? You could do like a read and then a write, like not adaptively, I guess.
So in this matrix, we only cared about the total number of queries.
Exactly. Yes. No, we're not counting the rounds in some sense.
So each query is retrieve a location from the database.
Exactly. We're counting the number of RAM queries.
Right.
We're thinking of a round as just like 1 RAM query.
So it's not the number of messages, it's just if you
Yep.
sent a long message consisting of retrieve
Right.
many indices, this would count as many queries.
Exactly. It's just looking at doing lookups. Yeah. Good question. So Dwork, Naor, Rothblum, and Vaikuntanathan showed a restricted lower bound for this. They showed that if their memory checker is something called deterministic and non-adaptive, then the query complexity has to be at least log n over log n, showing that the previous construction I mentioned is tight. But what does this deterministic and non-adaptive constraint mean? It says that for any time you do a user query to some logical index I, the physical locations you look at on the server are totally fixed as a function of I. So in particular, there's no randomness, like you can't look up any random locations in your physical queries, and you can't be adaptive. And you really can't be adaptive in any sense of it. Like you can't, based on the contents you looked up, you can't look up a different location and things like that. So really it's just some fixed sequence of locations as a function.
There's
of I.
capture constructions where it's like the determinism is coming from PRF key.
So good. So here the contents can be randomized. It's just the locations have to be deterministic, and both of the constructions I mentioned are in fact deterministic and non-adaptive. Like both the Merkle and the PRF, like there is randomness in the constructions, but where you look up is totally fixed. It's just like nodes in a binary tree. And there's a broad theme in theoretical computer science that randomness in interaction could possibly help. So it begs the question, like, is there a general lower bound or is there a better construction? What if you assume,
So I have a question for the previous slide. So do those lower bounds apply to Merkle? Like, I guess.
Yes, so exactly. So the Merkle tree is deterministic and non-adaptive. And so if you're considering only deterministic and non-adaptive memory checkers, then this is a tight lower bound.
Okay.
Right, but I guess the question is like, if you were to allow a memory checker to use randomness or to use adaptivity, can you do better? And this is unanswered by this work. Yeah, good question. Okay, so as the main results, we show that every memory checker must have query complexity at least log n over log n. And this is tied up to constant factors based on the construction I mentioned. It's unconditional, so it doesn't depend on any crypto or computational assumption. And it handles randomized and adaptive memory checkers, unlike the previous lower bound. And so just putting in the picture here, we give a log n over log n lower bound, which is just. We also consider a setting where the read and write query complexity could be different. In the sense that maybe you're doing lots of reads and few writes, then maybe you want the reads to be more efficient than the writes. Select Q sub R to note the query complexity of the reads, and Q sub W, the query complexity of the writes. We show that if the read query complexity is like little o of log n over log n, then the write query complexity has to be super polylogarithmic. And then in a more extreme sense, if the read query complexity is constant, then the write query complexity has to be polynomial. And these are actually both tied up to constant factors from a construction of Dwork et al. And previously, there was no lower bound known for any read or write query complexity trade-off. You can ask about the other way, like what if you do writes more efficiently than reads? And this is actually an open question. So does there exist a memory checker with a read query complexity like log n over log n and write query complexity 1? So we don't know the answer, but we give some like partial answer to this question, which is that if we add the restriction of being deterministic and non-adaptive in the same sense as Dwork et al, then we get the exact opposite quantitative behavior. If the write query complexity is little o of log n over log n, then the read query complexity is super polylogarithmic, and similarly for the more extreme setting. And this is also tied up to constant factors, but for the class of deterministic and non-adaptive memory checkers. And we give some like weak evidence that this is not obviously going to be extendable to randomized or adaptive memory checker constructions, but we don't know what the answer is.
So you think you can't achieve it, or just that these techniques themselves are not going to grow into lower bound?
The techniques themselves aren't going to go. But yeah, I really don't know. It's just a hunch. Good. So let me mention a few like implications of this that I haven't mentioned before, which is that Wang, Liu, Papamantu, and Zhang defined a notion of locality for memory checkers, which is the number of like far away, like non-contiguous physical query locations you access per query. So it's okay if you query a bunch of places that are close in physical memory, but not if they're far away. And this is motivated by some systems concerns of like efficiency optimization. And roughly speaking, they show that the locality has to be at least the query complexity. And so now just by plugging in our lower bound, we get a log n over log n lower bound for the locality of memory checkers as well as query complexity. Also, Surya Mathialagan defined a notion of parallel memory checking, which if you have a bunch of like users accessing the same memory at the same time, and just by plugging in our lower bound, we can show that even randomized and adaptive parallel memory checkers must have total work with an overhead factor of at least log n over log n. And then lastly, there are a bunch of ORAM constructions that are secure in like an honest but curious setting. And one can ask whether one can generically compile these honest but curious constructions into malicious constructions. So previous work showed that if you did have such a compiler, then that would be a memory checker with a similar overhead. And therefore, plugging in our results, we can show there's no black box compiler from honest but curious to malicious ORAMs that is less than log n over log n overhead.
Sorry, I missed it. Like, do your results apply to randomized and adaptive?
Yes. Yeah. So this is the difference between our work and Dwork et al. Dwork et al. Did not apply to randomized or adaptive, and we apply to both.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really necessary for the ORAM results, because ORAM, certainly has to be randomized, and may have to be adaptive, and as a result, this black box compiler result didn't really make sense with just the Dwork et al. Lower bound.
I don't understand why ORAM has to be randomized and adaptive.
I mean, the query locations should it can't be the same. Like if you're going to query index I twice, you can't look at the same locations twice because that would leak privacy, right?
No, but I guess the randomized and adaptive is talking about the memory checker, not the ORAM, right?
Right, but the results would, it says that if you had a black box compiler, then you'd have a memory checker. But that the memory checker you built would be randomized from the ORAM construction. So like the way we proved this result was that saying if you had a compiler, then like a compiler plus an ORAM plugged in would be a memory check would be a memory checker, and the ORAM part of it would be randomized.
Are you saying for maliciously secure ORAM already gives you a memory checker?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I'm saying something more here, but yes, that is right.
So tightness on this though, is it order log n for the positive results here?
Good. Okay, so in terms of like black box compiling, it is tight because there's a memory checker with the same overhead. But in terms of like difference between honest but curious and malicious, no, you can actually get away with the same overhead. And I'll get to it in the next slide. But any other questions before I go on? Don't want to lose people. Good. So just to summarize what's known in this like remote cloud storage setting broadly, if you're caring about privacy, both of like data privacy and access pattern privacy, ORAM is the solution. There's an upper bound of log n, and there's a lower bound of log n. So this is theoretically this is tight. And for integrity, there's an upper bound of log n over log n, and we show a matching lower bound. And then lastly, if you want privacy and integrity at the same time, prior work shows a construction with an upper bound of log n, and the same ORAM lower bound just directly applies here. So this is also tight. Okay, good. So now I'll transition into a little bit of an overview of how we prove our results. But any questions before I go on? Okay. So here's our theorem statement. Roughly speaking, what we're going to do is we're going to give a compression argument. We're going to say that if you have a memory checker that's a little bit too, has better query complexity than log n over log n, then you can compress random bits of information, and then we can invoke Shannon type arguments, say this is a possible. And so just to get a flavor of it, let's say Alice wants to transmit some uniformly random subset of 1 through n to Bob, where the set has size k. We're going to use the fact that this requires log of n choose k bits, even if Alice and Bob are allowed to share some random string in the sky that's independent of the subset.
Question is that this is an information theoretic argument. Does it
Yeah.
require computational?
Good. So it is a totally information theoretic argument. In the analysis, we're going to use the fact that there is a like efficient attack that's really like in the analysis. We're going to argue that it works because there's an efficient attack on memory checker that we're really doing. It's a great question. But yeah, Alice and Bob here are really just information theoretic. Yeah, I guess just to clarify, like our lower bound, it does also apply for statistically sound memory checkers, but it's just like a super weak lower bound. Okay, good. So before going forward, I'm going to define some notation. So let's say M is the number of entries in the public untrusted database. So in general, it could be like bigger than n. Certainly, it should be bigger than n. But for simplicity, we'll assume that it's at most a polynomial in the number of entries n. I'm going to let W be the physical word size of each entry. It's like how many bits we're storing on the server for each RAM entry. And I'm going to assume it's at most polylogarithmic in n. I'm going to let DB denote the public database. So you can think of this as a vector of like words of length W and M of them for each of the public database entries. And I'll show it as this little like ladder looking or array looking figure here. And then lastly, I'm going to let ST denote the local state, the trusted state inside the memory checker. And I'll show it as this little like RAM icon. Okay. Good, so here's a first attempt. Alice, we have Alice on the left, we have Bob on the right. Alice is going to publicly initialize some memory checker. And as a result is going to get some like initial database DB0 and some public state ST0. And think of this as a shared randomness between Alice and Bob. This is no dependence on the set S at the moment. Just some initialized thing. And then here's what Alice is going to do now that she looks at her set S. For every element in S, she's going to write like 1 at that index I as sort of an indication that, okay, I have index I in my set. And this will result in, you know, some interaction between the database and the memory checker. So like for writing the first index of S, Alice might, you know, do a few writes to a few places in the database and then some more writes and so on. And so the number of gray cells here is going to be at most K times Q. K here because there are K elements in the set S, and Q because Q is the query complexity. So each of these writes is going to touch at most Q locations in the public database. But of course, you know, after doing these writes, we're going to have a different public database. I'll call it DB0, DB1, to denote that updated database. And we're going to have some updated local state, ST1. It'll, you know, it could be different than before. And now Alice is just going to send over the state ST1, the updated state at the end of these writes to Bob. Think of this as sort of like a streaming style argument here. And then what's Bob's recovery strategy going to be? For every index I from 1 through n, Bob will try reading index I into the memory checker with the state that Alice sent over. Good, you know, this will interact with some database, but the issue here is that Bob doesn't have DB1, Bob only has DB0, the old database that was shared as public randomness. And so one of two things can happen. Either the memory checker is going to respond with a 0 or a 1. And by the soundness property of the memory checker, we know that if this is a 0 or 1, then it exactly corresponds to membership in S. So here we're learning information about S if we get a 0-1 response. And so we have to argue that this is actually computationally efficient. But I'll swipe it under the rug for now. But of course, there's another issue, right? Another option. The memory checker could abort, indicating that there's some like flag, some issue, because interacting with DB0 instead of DB1. Maybe it notices that. And so, you know, how do we deal with this case? It's not so clear what to do if we run into this case. So how do we prevent it? Well, okay, we've used soundness so far, and we should try using completeness in some sense. But the issue is that completeness only applies if the database is an honest server, you know, if there's no modifications. But DB0 and DB1 disagree, so the server response isn't an honest server. But one could maybe naively hope, that every time, or for many times when Bob does a read to index I, hopefully it'll avoid all the gray cells. If this is the case, then we can invoke completeness. Yeah, if Bob does not touch any of the gray cells, then it looks like it's interacting with an honest database, and therefore we can invoke completeness and get the right answer from the memory checker. So this is the hope. But the issue is that this actually, in general, is not going to happen. Like, let's think of a Merkle tree. Every query you're going to do is going to touch the root of the Merkle tree, and so the Merkle tree is going to be gray, and every read touches the root. And so this sort of argument instantly dies, at least in this simplicity. So what do we do? A natural way to get around this is to partition your database into some heavy locations and light locations. I'll denote the heavy ones as green and the light ones as red. And what we're going to do is Alice is going to send the updated heavy elements to Bob. And because they're heavy, there maybe shouldn't be too many of these. And then we're going to hope that Bob's read to index I is going to avoid not all of the gray locations, but just the light gray locations. That's sufficient because Bob has updated elements on the heavy set. And just for simplicity, I'll define some like bad set for Bob to avoid as the light elements that are modified, these gray sets. And what we'll show is sufficient is that the probability over I of a read touching this bad set should be at most 0.01. And we'll show this is enough for us. So just to bring it back to the protocol, here's what we had originally a few slides ago. What we're going to do now is we're going to have, instead of just sending the updated state between Alice and Bob, Alice is also going to send a description of the heavy set H and the updated database on the heavy set. And the point is that Bob now has some hybrid database that it could use. It's like a DB0 on the light elements and DB1 on the heavy elements. Okay, let's analyze this. So let's say delta is some threshold that defines light versus heavy. So we have some probability of a given database elements, and the delta is going to be the defining line between light and heavy. But what is the distribution here? Well, let me be more precise. The distribution that we're going to consider is the following. First sample in index I uniformly at random from 1 through n. And then we're going to sample a uniformly random physical location when Bob is going to read index I from state 1 in, let's say, database 1. Yes, this is defined some fixed distribution, and we're going to define delta with respect to this distribution. And I'm going to claim that the probability of Bob's read being bad, in other words, touching anything in bad, is at most this quantity k delta q squared. Okay, how do I do it? So first, we're going to union bound over the q physical queries that happen in the read to I. So that this probability is going to be at most q times the probability that x is in bad, where this is sort of by construction of the distribution D that we defined. And remember that bad here is going to be a subset of the light elements. And so in particular, every element in bad is going to have probability at most delta. This is what the light set here is. And just by summing over all the elements of bad, we're going to have this bound. And then remember that the size of this bad set is at most k times q, because there are most k times q of modified elements in total. So here we get k delta q squared is exactly as I claimed. And so now what we can do is we can set k to be 1 over this quantity, so that this probability is at most 0.01. Or in other words, 99% of Bob's reads in the recovery strategy are going to succeed. Okay, so let's continue. So since 99% of these reads succeed, it turns out that Bob can recover linear in k number of bits of entropy of the set S. And this requires a little bit of a calculation, yeah?
Is this the same k as the parameter we set on the last slide?
Yep, same k. Yeah, k here throughout will be the size of the set S.
Can we go back to last slide? I just want to look at the definition of k again. So q is positive, anything greater than 1, but because delta is low, this k could potentially be greater than 1 still.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any general guidance to how to set up delta?
Good. So we'll see it like a delta has to certainly be at least like 1 over n.
Oh.
It turns out, because we need k to be at most n, because like it's a subset of 1 through n. But yeah, the rest of the setting of delta will come from it'll come later in the analysis.
Okay.
Good question. Okay, so I was claiming that since 99% of these reads are going to succeed, Bob can recover roughly k bits of entropy of this subset S. And this requires some calculation, but the idea is like even in the worst case scenario, Bob is going to recover all zeros in these 99%. Like maybe k is like sublinear in n, and maybe Bob recovers only zeros for these 99%. But even in that case, Bob has reduced the universe size from n to n over 100. And that's that reduction gives k bits of information. And let's just remind ourselves, like, what has Alice sent to Bob? Alice has sent the local state, heavyset, and the database on the heavyset. And the heavyset can be specified in like a direct way with the size of h times log of m bits. And this database is the number of heavy elements times the word size, just to specify how many bits per word cell. And so what does the compression lemma tell us? We've communicated k bits of information by using just this message from Alice to Bob. So roughly speaking, this is the resulting inequality of the end. Does this make sense? Okay, I'll do a little bit of arithmetic here. If we isolate out the local state on its own, what we can get that the local state is at most some small factor. It's 1 over q squared of 1 over delta minus some quantity, I'll call it gamma, times the size of the heavy set. And this is what we want to optimize in our lower bound. Yeah, if we want this to be as big as possible, so that our lower bound on the local space is as big as possible. And so this is really the question. How can we choose a partition, H and L, to make this as large as possible? Right, so this is really just a probability question now. We have an arbitrary distribution on m elements and some parameter gamma. And how can we partition it into a light and heavy set with some delta, so that everything in the light set has probability m equals delta, and 1 over delta minus gamma times h, this quantity I've defined, is sufficiently large. Unfortunately, you can't do this. There's an explicit distribution, it turns out, where gamma is log m, and this quantity is essentially always at most 2. And so that's too bad for us. And so what do? We tried partitioning into a heavy and a light set. It didn't work. So why not 3? 2 didn't work. Just give it another shot. Try another set. See what happens. So we introduced an intermediate set M, and so that's in between the light and the heavy set in some sense. And we want M not to matter at a high level. And here, instead of a pointwise guarantee like we had on the light set, we're going to have a total guarantee, saying that the probability that the read touches anywhere in M is at most 1%. And so now if we union bound over the light case and the medium case, we're going to have 98% of reads are going to succeed instead of 99. And then by the union bound argument on our distribution D, it turns out we need the probability of anything in the medium set to be at most 1 over 100q. I just want to emphasize here, the difference between the light set and the medium set is that the medium set just needs a total, the sum of the probability of hitting anywhere in M is small, whereas in the light set, you need every individual element of the light set to be light. Okay, so now let's go to a final attempt of this lower bound picture. So here's what we had before. And now we're going to introduce a medium set here in orange or yellow. And so now the Bob's database is going to be DB0 on L and M, and it'll be DB1 on the heavy set H. But then Alice's message to Bob hasn't changed. It's just going to be the heavy set and the database on the heavy set. Okay, so let's think about this probability question with the updated version. So we have some distribution D. We want to find some tripartitioning so that everything in the light set is probability at most delta. The total probability of M is at most 1 over 100q. And this quantity 1 over delta minus gamma times h is large. And can you do this? Thankfully, yes, you can. And we show that such a partition always is going to exist with this parameter dependence. Don't worry about it too much for now, but it's n over roughly, think of gamma as polylog. So it's n over polylog to the 100q, or n over polylog to the q. And so just plugging in this quantity here, we get from our lower bound, plugging in this 1 over delta to be this thing. I'll save some arithmetic, but we get this lower bound that says that if the local state is at most n to the 1 minus epsilon, as we assumed at the very beginning, then the query complexity has to be at least log n over log n. And this is the end of the proof. So So let me talk a little bit about some loose ends that I swept under the rug here. Really, the one thing I really swept under the rug is that there's a circularity of parameters here. That's a little bit subtle, but it's that this parameter k, which is the size of the set S, is a function of delta. And delta is a parameter from the partition argument. But the partition argument can depend adaptively on the memory checker, because the delta, this distribution is defined after the memory checker has done a bunch of writes. And so delta could depend on the writes, and so we don't know what to set k in advance. The way we get around this is that Alice and Bob are going to guess a good value of delta. And thankfully, by our proof of the partition lemma, there are only going to be like q possible values of delta, one of which will be fine. And so we're going to have a guess at this value. And more than that, Alice and Bob are going to like pad these k writes with like some initial writes that don't matter at all. And so there will always be like n over 10 writes to the memory checker. And so the memory checker has no idea what your actual guess for k is, and therefore it can't adaptively do behavior depending on how many writes k do. And lastly, I want to talk about a connection to relaxed locally decodable codes that's happening here. So what's a locally decodable code? It's an error correcting code where bit recovery, it takes a few queries. There's a locality requirement. And there's a notion of a relaxed locally decodable code, which allows this recovery procedure to abort if it notices that there's an error in the code word. So in other words, like on the correct code word, on a unmodified code word, it should give you the correct value. But on an incorrect code word, on a slightly corrupted code word, it either tells you the right answer or it says, oh, there was an issue. This is a corrupted code. And this three-way partition argument we had into light, medium, and heavy is really inspired by lower bound techniques for relaxed locally decodable codes. And specifically, like a similar version of this heavy, medium, light decomposition showed up in a paper of Oded Goldreich, but it was used in a little bit of a different way. But similar moral idea of introducing a medium set to get things to work. How much time do I have, by the way? Is it
10 minutes?
Okay. In that case, let me try to give a quick sketch of the partition proof. It's like, how do we actually get this partition? Remember, I'm just giving this statement again. We want everything in the light set to have probability at most delta. We want the total probability of the medium set to be 1 over c for some parameter c. Think of it as like linear and cube. And we want this quantity 1 over delta minus gamma times h to be this big. And some bonus, we'll say delta has some form that it's one of like roughly q-ish options. But don't worry about that for now. So here's the proof idea. The proof idea is we're going to have c different buckets. And we're going to think of it as like a histogram of the distribution. We're going to think of these buckets as like geometrically increasing intervals from like starting from 2 gamma over n to 2 gamma squared over n to 2 gamma cubed over n and so on. And by some averaging argument, we know that the total mass of one of these buckets has to be at most 1 over c. Just because the sum of the total mass of all these buckets is 1 because it forms a partition. So like fix this b sub j that has like smaller than average mass. And this is just going to define our partition for us. The medium set is going to be this b sub j. The light set is going to be everything below b sub j. And the heavy set is going to be everything above b sub j. And so let me argue why this is sufficient. So the second bullet point here is like directly satisfied by construction of the medium set. The total probability of the medium set is at most 1 over c. For the light set, I'm just writing out what the light set is. It's every element that has probability at most this quantity. And so we could just set delta to be that quantity that defines it. And by like a Markov counting argument, since everything in the heavy set has probability at least this amount, the size of the heavy set has to be inverse of that. And so now we can just do out the math, like 1 over delta minus gamma times h. You can lower bound by exactly the term that we wanted. And as a bonus here, like delta here exactly is of the form that I promised. In particular, it depends only on j, which there are like c options for. Okay, let me take a step back and then summarize what I've talked about. So memory checkers remove the need to trust integrity of a cloud service when using a remote cloud storage. And we proved tight unconditional lower bounds for memory checkers. And previously, this was only known for a special case of deterministic and non-adaptive memory checkers. And as an open question, I'll leave is a read-write trade-off that I mentioned earlier. Is there a memory checker with read query complexity log n over log n and write query complexity 1? You know, if there is, then there might be a memory checker that's super efficient in a setting where there's lots of writes and not too many reads. And we show that like the answer to this is no if you just have deterministic and non-adaptive memory checkers, but we don't know a general number. All right, that's all. Thanks so much.
Any questions? Also for the Zoom audience, do you have any questions?
I don't have like a full question right now, but I guess just watching your talk, I was sort of getting deja vu from reading Goldreich's analysis.
Oh,
and
okay.
You mentioned it. I guess is there like a connection? Do you think you can prove better RLDC lower bounds? Because there's like a small gap there with your techniques, or is there like
Yeah.
a way to go from constructions and memory checkers to better constructions or RLDCs or something similar?
I would be pretty surprised if you could.
Okay.
Like the way it's actually used in a lower bound is a little bit different. Like this medium set, it just turns out like in my view that there's the same bottleneck of like and they both have this like the relax notion and like the abort notion here are like really the same. So they sound very similar. Yeah, maybe there is something deeper. I don't see why there should be, but maybe there is. It's a great question. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something in the chat.
Okay. No online question.
For data, okay. George asks, for database, does this work allow one table or can be multiple tables? Database, does this work? Good. So I guess, what do you mean by multiple tables? Like, how would that, are you imagining like multiple non-colluding servers or something like this? Or, like, I guess, why couldn't you concatenate these different tables into one bigger table? I guess I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Multiple tables can be relational database. Okay. Yeah, I guess the model we're considering in this work is just of RAM queries. Like we're not allowing any relational lookups here. But whether there is some notion of this for like relational databases, I think is very interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about it.
I like the other version of that question. What happens if you have two different sets of memory? Because that's actually where a lot of the locally decodable code kind of ideas came from at the very beginning. Was what can we do with a lot of different sources out in the world that don't talk to each other or don't sufficiently collude beyond the threshold? To any of these bounds, well, you have like three RAM somewhere, and you ask them each independently.
I see. Yeah, I guess I actually haven't thought about this. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we can answer online, but I'll think about it.
Cool stuff next year.
What assumptions would you make on this non-collision or?
I mean, you can dial it, like a lot of people in the quantum world like to have completely, spatially separated versions of like two of them, and they just don't have time to talk to each other based on physical limits or just definitions of your model. And the other is you have n of them, and then
That's one of them.
yeah, right, or one out of n, or
I see.
log n out of n, that sort of thing. But that probably answers the upper bounds, but I don't know about lower bounds in that case. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Next things, Neekon, okay?
quantum information is also this state.